の原点はキングストントリオ。でも今回はジョン・スチュワートではなくデイブ・ガード時代のナンバーを中心にお送りしたいと思います。それでは The New Frontiers -1 です。どうぞ。
Morning breaks. Every once in a while there's that album, A New Frontier. This one is Top Teen Talent. Looks interesting. None of the groups on it are teens though. It claims to be rock from Great Britain. Only half the songs on it are actually from the UK. If it was not clear enough due to this text, this album is an unofficial bootleg from Thailand. An odd one at that. The music on it, it is rock. Eric Clapton's versions of Motherless Children and Please Be With Me. Not a huge Clapton head, but doubtlessly influential, and he is rock. Blue Oyster Cult's ME262. Love me some Blue Oyster Cult, good choice. Then, Jar? What is Jar? Wait, who is East for that matter? Who are East? Ruse Seto? Who were East? Only dedicated listeners of the FEN, Far Eastern Network, remember them. FEN then was the network of American military stations that crisscrossed Asia, though generally based around Japan and the Philippines. These radio stations dominated the airwaves for English listeners in Asia post-World War II. Unsurprisingly, East, usually stylized as East in all capital letters, was a Japanese band, technically. They had one song in the early 1970s, Beautiful Morning. That was more than enough to get them across the Pacific to the United States, mainly California, where they signed with Capitol Records. They had one album, the self-titled East, in 1972. That was it. The strange thing about East is, beside a very brief appearance on the charts beside Elton John, they were not a hit in Japan nor the United States. They were only a hit on American military installations in Japan, where Japanese folk and 1960s American rock mixed. Their American-targeted rock style, crossed with Japanese folk and pre-Bob Dylan folk revivalism, was better received in mainland Asia, in countries where FEN could be picked up, but the legitimacy in rock at that time was in an American contract across the Pacific. East was a very odd case that evolved in a very odd and unique direction. East did actually make it, by all technical indicators of success. They got an American recording contract after all. Capitol Records signed them around 1969-1970. Capitol's marketing plan was to turn East into the Japanese Beatles of, well, the East. That's how they had been presented to the American public by the United States music press after all. The mid-1960s had seen the British invasion across the Atlantic, so the early 1970s, it was assumed, was primed for a cultural invasion across the Pacific from the East, a Japanese invasion. The economic miracle in Japan and the dominance of GS, group sounds, in Japanese music suggested to executives in the United States that Japanese music was ready to overflow into the Pacific and across to the United States. The problem, their spearhead, East, was a folk band made to masquerade as a rock band. They may have been the most literal case of this happening too. East's influences were not the Beatles or the Byrds, but the Kingston Trio and the Brothers Four, folk bands. In Japan, East was actually the New Frontiers, or variations such as Nufo Nufu. Their thrust into the American market then was odd, haphazard, and overall strange. American marketers trying to sell talented Japanese multi-instrumentalists to an American audience, an audience losing interest in old-school folk music through awkward marketing appeals to Eastern mysticism and that mysterious orient of the 1970s. It was the era of California Buddhism, but East loved English folk music. There's psychedelic twists and turns investigating the East, the sun that never technically rose in the United States. So who composed East? It was a 5-man band stocked full of talent. Ruse Seto was the voice of the band, both on vocals and writing. He also played guitar and biwa, still does. All but 2 of East's songs were credited to him. His father was a traveling businessman who, maybe, not entirely sure here, worked for Nippon Columbia. Or maybe the younger Seto did. Either way, this meant Seto traveled a lot, even into adulthood. He picked up conversational English in India while living there for 3 years, learned pronunciation from English-language folk music, and spent a grueling year studying English grammar while sending the New Frontiers, soon-to-be East, demo tape to every American record label he could find a mailing address for. Remember, this was back in the 1960s, 1970s. Seto worked at a record company prior to striking out to the United States as a folk singer, so he had experience in the music business. His English pronunciation and lack of accent while singing is famously so perfect, people have argued about if he is actually Japanese. He is actually Japanese. Important note here, Seto's first name was misspelled as Ruse somehow on the 1972 album, so his identity was, in English, unclear for years. Seto's daughter, who is also a musician, has confirmed to me Ryusuke and Ruse Seto are one and the same person. It's just an error. Though, there is a totally different younger Ryusuke Seto who has no relationship to this one. This younger one is a different person. The Ryusuke Seto related to East professionally goes by Aman Ryusuke Seto nowadays. Aman meaning peace in Sanskrit. Morita was Seto's longtime friend, who had been a constant in several of his groups prior to East. He still is. Seto and Morita were arguably the core of the New Frontiers. Morita was/is a multi-instrumentalist interested in folk music. It was claimed in promotional material for East he mastered the shakuhachi, Japanese flute, and koto, Japanese zither, in 3 days. Morita then was the one largely responsible for the Japanese touches on East's debut and only album. He's also a little out there, a little strange. He actually dropped out of graduate school, he was studying chemistry, to come risk it all in the United States circa 1970 with Seto and the rest of the band. Anyways, he's still friends with Seto and still a musician, alongside a lot of other things. Noboru Asahi was the bassist for East. He started as the bassist for the student folk group the Black Lily Singers in college. There's basically no information on them beside this one mention, it seems. Asahi is the one sitting cross-legged in the Buddha pose on the cover. You know, to appeal to the East. He actually left music after East in 1972, but returned 51 years later. That'll come 51 years later. Drummer Fumio Adachi is the member of East with the least amount of information in English or Japanese. He seems to have been responsible for a lot of the American folk influence on the album, crediting the Kingston Trio's rendition of the death ballad Tom Dooley as a major influence. He studied harmony, playing the drums, organ, piano, and percussion. Adachi and Asahi seem to have been the last additions to what would become East after Seto, Morita, and Yoshikawa. Also, Ted Yoshikawa, actually Chui Yoshikawa. Actual real name Tadahide Yoshikawa, he has a lot of names. Yoshikawa met Ryusuke Seto and Gen Morita in college. Yoshikawa is and was a respected guitar virtuoso, a well-known guitar tutor in Japan, a multi-talented musician with a repertoire of talent in the shakuhachi, flute, harmonica, biwa, taishigoto, Japanese harp, and several other instruments. Yoshikawa was apparently the showman of the group, telling English jokes to the usually American audience. He only quit his job to fully join the band after he had received his December bonus in 1970. He had to be sure before heading to the United States. Curious note here, Tadahide was in fact Yoshikawa's grandfather's name as well. Presumably that's where the adopted anglicized nickname / stage name Ted he used came from. The elder Tadahide Yoshikawa was actually the station master of Shibuya Station in Tokyo during the 1920s and 1930s. Yeah, Yoshikawa's grandfather was the station master in the story of Hachiko the dog. The younger Yoshikawa, the musician, even has pictures to prove this as historical fact. It is in fact a very small world. So who were East exactly? East, a name used purely for the American market, began as the New Frontiers folk group which emerged from several bands formed by the members in high school and college during the 1960s. One of these was vocalist Ryusuke Seto's jazz folk fusion student group, the Four Frogs. The name was a double-sided pun on the California folk group, the Brothers Four, and probably jazz musician Woody Herman's Four Brothers. The New Frontiers as a standardized group, though, only solidified around 1966. The group started as a college band, decided they had to break up to focus on studies for about a month, but then found they had too much fun playing to just stop. They then spent their time after work/classes practicing and occasionally staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning to write new songs. The problem the New Frontiers encountered was English language folk music was, during the 1960s in Japan, relegated to a small niche of mere cover bands who were not respected outside their circuits. A majority of these were cover bands of influential California folk bands popular in Japan, like the Kingston Trio, Brothers Four, and singers/writers like Jon Stewart, an alumni of the Kingston Trio. On the other hand, 1960s rock music, outside group sounds as a genre in Japan, which usually had English lyrics anyways, was only identified with the English language in Japan, so mostly British and American rock. Native Japanese language rock was stymied in acceptance until 1973-1975. This left the New Frontiers in a bind. They were a Japanese folk band who performed largely in English. Acceptance and pay was hard to come by in Japanese clubs/live houses. The first few smaller-run albums by the New Frontiers, using a lineup different from the one that would later compose East, went largely under the radar. They only sold a few hundred copies each. Radar, that was it. Nearly all the members of the New Frontiers at the time, the group that would develop into East, were pretty good English speakers. They then got work performing on American military bases and English tourist locales as a band, an occupation that put them somewhat at ends with other folk bands who were more anti-American military presence in Japan. The foreign audiences, though, were much more receptive to the New Frontiers' menagerie of original and cover folk material than the local Japanese audiences. For foreign audiences, they would even gussy it up with some rock and roll material. They got ears on their music, and it paid well. Guitarist Yoshikawa claimed the pay from one night headlining a show for Americans in the 1960s could pay each member of the band nearly as well as a week's salary working in Japan. Maybe exaggeration, but he meant only as the headliners. Their main circuit being in the cities of Tachikawa and Yokosuka around Tokyo. The group was highly regarded by both American troops and tourists who liked their unique mix of folk and rock sound. Singing and joking with the crowd in English also helped. At some point, a copy of their song Beautiful Morning, maybe a demo, maybe the actual album release, slipped into the hands of a DJ on the FEN, Far Eastern Network, who would play it regularly on air. It then became somewhat of a hit in syndication across Japan, the Philippines, and other places in Asia where the network could be picked up, such as in Thailand. Ruse Seto, though, had a dream of breaking into the American market to legitimize the New Frontiers as a group. The New Frontiers did have brushes with fame prior to becoming East in 1972, though. According to Ruse Seto, the New Frontiers, unclear what incarnation exactly, had been invited to perform on the Ed Sullivan Show in the summer of 1966. It was a big opportunity that only a few other Japanese bands would ever be offered. The New Frontiers very well could have been the next Beatles from that alone. This, though, would have required the group traveling across the Pacific in 1966, which would have been somewhat difficult when every member was in college. They would have to either drop out or opt out of the appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. In the end, they opted out. The dream of becoming a Japanese Beatles had to be deferred until college, undergraduate graduation, in 1969. Seto to this day is still conflicted about having turned down that opportunity, haunted by what could have been. There is a reason for this regret. By the time the New Frontier/East got to the United States in 1970-1971, folk was well on the way out in favor of rock and roll. This drove Ryusuke to dream of signing with Capitol Records, the keeper of such legacies as the Kingston Trio, the Beatles, and even Frank Sinatra in the United States. That was the gateway to the American music market, and thus legitimacy in Japan. An American brand or label would be able to legitimize the identity of the New Frontiers in Japan through America. Seto then made the decision to go live in California for a year, with only a guitar to provide for himself, or so goes the legend. He was so inspired by the music scene in San Francisco, though technically he lived in San Jose at the time, and Hollywood, he returned to Japan and convinced the rest of the New Frontiers to leg it out to California. They had missed their opportunity on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1966, but the 1970s would be different. It actually was. The formation of the New Frontiers that would become East made it out to California. After several good reviews around Hollywood, and high praise on the San Francisco Examiner, the New Frontiers were able to perform at the Troubadour Club in Santa Monica. It went over amazingly well, and there was suddenly a new hot talent in town. Against all odds, an offer, one of many, came in from a scout. For Capitol Records of all places, to band manager Ken Nagano. Second chances do happen, but... So why East? It was an awfully generic name even back in 1972. Capitol Records decided to rebrand the folk band New Frontiers to the rock band East. 1960s folk bands turned into rock bands in the early 1970s were not that uncommon. Blue Oyster Cult literally did the exact same thing with Blue Oyster Cult in 1971. So the case of East was not a unique transvaluation of trying to sell a Japanese band to an American audience. Marketers seemed desperate to fashion East into the spearhead for a Japanese cultural invasion of the United States music market. Despite that, their sound as East became more pseudo-California folk rock than a Japanese equivalent to the Beatles. Capitol Records de-emphasized East of their more unique influences, such as the Kingston Trio, in favor of a tepid mess of psychedelic rock with a few Japanese touches. It was neither overwhelming or underwhelming. It was simply whelming. They were branded East as in a light from the East, a sort of fake ice cream Zen cone. Their single EP in 1972, Colorado Moonbeam / Kano no Nakano Kanaria, though sounded more like Diet Gordon Lightfoot than anything actually from the East, formerly known as New Frontiers. It featured lyrics like, "Cold rusty rain corroding my eyes, riding through the street, dirty gray skies, unknown lies, on every face I can see." By these lyrics, it is probably obvious, the New Frontiers was a Japanese folk band focused on performing Western folk music. Sure, philosophically speaking, they had several inspirations from Japanese culture, because they were from Japan, but their sound was fundamentally based on the American folk music of the 1950s and 1960s. Also, Canadian folk music could be included too, any folk music from the Anglosphere. That identity of the Japanese Beatles the music press was beginning to promote East with could not be further from the truth. At best, it was an attempt to uplift a new contender into the hole the Beatles had left post-Abbey Road in 1969. At worst, publications simply ran with the title because they were a group of Japanese guys with somewhat shaggy hair and jeans? Yeah, that makes the new Beatles. Their single album played into it anyways. Noboru Asahi, bereft of shoes because Japan, strikes a pseudo-Buddha meditation pose on the cover, while the rest of the group awkwardly sits in the black background as post-1960s rockers who arrived too early to be really in the 1970s culture. The odd men out once again. The advertisements for East similarly dripped with Oriental Zen 1970s kitsch, and wantonly abused ellipses and taglines, such as this ad from Billboard. East, not just a name. More a signpost, a direction, a path. East, ellipses, a spirit, ellipses, a reconciliation of the electric sounds of rock and the instruments of traditional Japanese music, ellipses, performed in English, but with the tranquil spirit of Zen, ellipses. East, ellipses, 5 musicians, ellipses, with one soul, one sound, ellipses, East, like a single poem, ellipses, asking you to listen to the sounds and soul of the whole earth, ellipses, East, ellipses, a group and an album on Capitol Records. As said, similar to an ice cream or even popsicle stick Zen cone. So, how is East 1972 as an album? Meh, okay. Those who like 1970s psychedelia might like it. The main issue that undercuts most, if not nearly all, of East 1972 is the album sounds particularly dated for 1972. This was the same year Steely Dan's Can't Buy a Thrill and Blue Oyster Cult's debut albums hit after all. David Bowie would tour Japan 1 year later in 1973, setting off rock and roll fever over there. So East with their psychedelic folk rock was sort of lost in the shuffle. East, 1972, as said, still sits squarely in the late 1960s. There's tones of Gordon Lightfoot, awkward post-Bob Dylan gestures, and there's been at least one comparison to 1960s British blues. Most will 100% like one song on the album, but few will actually enjoy the entire album. That will be important later. The album is the definition of fascinating, but overall, unfortunately, not particularly good. Beautiful Morning is the only song that received really any notice from East in 1972. It was particularly popular in Asia, and the reason this video, you're watching, so subscribe, even exists. A pleasant psychedelic ballad, but lacks memorable lyrics. The words, as usual, late 1960s fare. Ruse Seto's voice, though, is wonderful and striking, so the words do not matter, really. The more ambient elements in the song Seto would return to later in his career, with more interesting ambient electronic prog rock elements, revising the song for a new audience. A later expanded Japanese release of Beautiful Morning by Seto would see extensive airplay on All Night Nippon in Japan, really the only element of East that made contact with the homeland. Beautiful Morning is the most memorable track, and is understandable why, if people remember anything from East, it is this song. The next song, the second on the album, is similarly moody and somber. Similar to Beautiful Morning, Me has a few Japanese touches in the strings. One could say there's even a Pink Floyd influence on Me, but it seems unlikely East was directly inspired by Pink Floyd. It came too early for them to be exposed to Pink Floyd. There are seeds of prog rock here that never blossom, only a very brief 10-second crescendo at the end, which makes the song memorable. The rest of it leaves the mind rather quickly. It is simply not for me. The album then goes from somber, pseudo-early prog rock into an out-and-out upbeat country song. Geese on the Road. Yeah, this is the only song credited to Morito, who takes the main vocals on it. It has catchy, though not amazingly complex lyrics. Geese on the road and seen by the drivers. Geese on the road, but don't you go home. Geese on the road and seen by the drivers. Geese on the road, but you may get cold. Geese on the Road is where it becomes apparent the album is sort of incoherent in tone, whiplash between upbeat and downbeat without much direction between songs. It is not incoherent in a good way either. Halfway through Geese on the Road, the song shifts into a totally different folk ballad, then the last third is a funky breakdown with ad-libbing. It's likely a reference to the Kingston Trio. Curious. She, the third song, is more like meh. Ephemeral, soft, mellow folk rock. Not boring, but forgettable padding. It is only a minute and 25 seconds, so could have been cut. Next. Lumber and Moses is a lumbering little Americana-inspired folk song. It is enjoyable and does sound very 1960s. Lumber here means lumberjack, if one is curious. One of those classical ditties with an endlessly upbeat charm, but honestly depressing lyrics when one looks at it. It is safe to assume Seto had an actual person in mind when writing the song. It is about a lonely lumberjack who keeps photos of his lost family on the walls of his cottage until they're yellow with age and dust. Soulful little song with pleasant charm. Not world-shattering, but enjoyable. Deaf-Eyed Julie surprisingly opens with a little ambient distortion. It is another slow psychedelic ballad with a veneer of Japanese instrumentation. It has a few passing similarities with Me, moody, smoky vocals, and a focus on the instrumentation. This one is a song about a woman. Always have to have one of those on a 1970s album. Not surprising when we have things like Brandy. Deaf-Eyed Julie is the most 1970s sounding song on the album as well. One of the album's what could have been songs. A more progressive, for 1972, sound could have served the lyrics well. Unfortunately, Deaf-Eyed Julie is stuck in an awkward no man's land between 1960s folk rock and very early 1970s pop. The conclusion on the drums is swell though. Black-Hearted Woman, not the Allman Brothers Band song, is another one about a woman. Here's one of the album's standout songs as well. Fast, upbeat, and fun lyrics. It is a more typical rock song that is served by East's folk background and Seto's vocal talents. One can hear tones East picked up from faster folk songs like the Kingston Trio's version of El Matador, which they often covered as The New Frontiers. They still cover it. Black-Hearted Woman is another what could have been like Deaf-Eyed Julie, though, honestly, Black-Hearted Woman is a strong enough song on its own, it could have become a hit had it been picked up anywhere. Obviously, it simply withered on the vine like the rest of the album. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be for East. Call Back the Wind. It has a flute. It is okay. It has a flute. Sad and slow. It has a flute. Next. Jar. This is what more of the album should have sounded like. On Jar, there's a lot of drum and fiery strings. It is a sibling to Lumber and Moses, but with a more Eastern inflection, taking a few cues from Black-Hearted Woman. The song can be assumed to have been inspired by Seto's time in India. The lyrics an absurd plot about an unsatisfied man from Asia, most likely intended to be Japan, who travels to India. He becomes the apprentice to a guru to become his brother, then spends 30 years learning to be a jar on the recommendation of the guru. He learns to fill himself with love as a jar, which teaches him his lesson. It is a very 1960s song. This one should be given a few tries because it is so fun, and it will eventually win anyone over. Great. Everywhere. Everywhere is where East tried to play into the Japanese instrumentation gimmick a little more. Marketing even included pictures of the instruments on the album to explain them to an American audience. It is an American rock song done on traditional Japanese instruments. Kind of. But that does not capture the dark tone of the song. It is more Enka-esque. It is very heavy on the strings and wispy vocals. Is it good? Is it novel? Yes. There's a lot of interesting noodling, but it never falls into place in a greater whole. Shin Sorang concludes the album, and well, it is the best and most unique of the material here. Ironic that the group more interested in English-language folk music would produce an American rock album, then conclude it on a rendition of a Japanese folk song, though Seto and Morita would return to the style. The title Shin Sorlan, an American mangling of Shin Soran, or literally Nu Soran Bushi. Soran Bushi being a traditional Japanese fisherman folk song or sea shanty, used while hauling in fish, or lines. Here is a high-energy, boisterous rendition of a folk song, Japanese and electric strings mixed freely in, with a heap of celebration. It ends the album on a blistering high note. If East gave birth to a burning star, it was Shin Soran. Shin Soran is the song that truly justifies East, and it always will be. This is the one glorious moment of the album. This one song is what should truly be remembered from it. Defa Julie, Jar, and Shin Soran then are the standouts of the album. The standouts of the brief moment that was East. So what happened to East? One can guess. Well, there's actually a few surprises. East, 1972, did chart, supposedly opposite Elton John, but only very briefly. There were growing complications for Capitol Records retaining a band from Japan. East's debut album saw a soft reception overall. Capitol did not have the funds to front an international band who was not selling that well, and economic competition between Japan and the United States was heating up, which would soon put work visas at a premium. Capitol Records could no longer foot the bill on the gamble that East had been. Reception in California had been warm, but East had failed to sell on a wider scale, basically making no impact on Japan. East, as Ruse Seto had feared, had been a few years too late to make their name in the United States. Well, the New Frontiers had made it, they had got a recording contract, but nobody would remember them as East in the USA. Their return to Japan saw barely any reception at home as well. East had been an identity created to sell in the United States. The Japanese market was coldly apathetic, if not outright dismissive. East was still the odd one out on both sides of the Pacific. If anything, East returned to Japan, the band now largely returned to using the name New Frontiers for performances, saw a soft disdain for the band's perceived cynical use of traditional Japanese instruments as being billed as a pseudo-American rock band. The culture clash was a little too much for the Japanese market at the time. Besides some brief and largely vague claims the band did a few commercial jingles in Japan, the group formerly known as East dissolved back into the New Frontiers, most of the members continuing on with their own solo careers. The dissolution of the band saw the leaving of Fumio Adachi and Noboru Asahi, while Ruse Seto and Gen Morita, occasionally with Ted Yoshikawa, returned to on and off again performances as the New Frontiers in both Japan and the United States, bouncing to and fro across the Pacific. The spirit of East was not dead though. The New Frontiers had always been that spirit. So what happened to this motley jean-wearing crew from the East? A lot of interesting things. Noboru Asahi, bassist, completely left the music industry after East in 1972. He eventually returned to Japan to complete his studies and live a life away from music. Until the bug returned. He returned 51 years later with his new English-Japanese album Beluga 2023. Talk about an overdue return. Beluga is an interesting throwback to 1960s Japanese lounge rock / blues. His label is Beluga Music Labo, if anyone is curious, and he is active on Instagram. He remembers East. Favorite song off his new album, People's Wishes. Welcome back. Ted, better known today as Chue Yoshikawa, never left. Outside occasional collaborations with Seto and Morita, Yoshikawa continued on in the music business with a string of his own solo albums in Japan, which occasionally featured East's old drummer, Fumio Adachi, throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He found his footing in Japan with songs like Don't Sing a Sad Song that alternate between bare-bones acoustic rock and folksy pop music. Yoshikawa built himself up in Japan as a guitar expert, which he still is, occasionally collaborating with members from Yellow Magic Orchestra. His later career shows what a beautiful player he is. The 1980s saw his collaborating on and off with jazzy soul pseudo-ambient collective REM Swimming Club Band, no relation to the other REM. These albums are scarce, even on the internet, but what can be found is supremely produced 1980s Japanese studio jazz. He continued on with his own independent work such as California Roll in 1987. Today, Yoshikawa, still an active musician, is a highly respected guitar tutor who appears in guitar magazines across Japan. While better known as a teacher in Japan, his catalog of music is deep and excellent. Drummer Fumio Adachi then? There's not really much on him after the 1970s, some session work here and there. Outside his parts on Yoshikawa's solo albums, Adachi did do session work on drums for the obscure Japanese singer-songwriter Kibo? Circa 1975. Kibo appears to have been another project that never got off the ground, unfortunately. Sounds okay. Adachi basically vanished after that, so he's probably still around somewhere, but who knows. Gun Morita, alongside Seto, continued along as folk singers in the United States and Japan until around 1986. Morita, upon his return to Japan, turned his attention to anti-war and green endeavors worldwide. He gives public presentations, translates books, and promotes organic, sustainable farming in line with traditional Japanese agriculture, alongside still performing. His blog shows he is the most, out there of the lot, though. Yeah. Anyways, the New Frontiers have continued to exist on and off since East disbanded in 1972. One of the more major reunions was on the Japanese program Wishbone in 1987 on January 31st. Most of the footage that's been seen here has been from that show because there's very little footage of East on the internet. In fact, there's literally no footage of East on the internet. Even Tom Guard, son of one of the original Kingston Trio founders, Dave Guard, has performed sporadically as a third member of the New Frontiers when in Japan. Beyond the original title, The New Frontiers, the group of Ruse Seto, Gun Morita, and a miscellaneous third member, sometimes Yoshikawa, sometimes Guard, have also made use of the name East of Kingston. Get it? East of Kingston? Like the band East and the group The Kingston Trio? Huh? When Morita and Seto perform as a duo alone, though, they use the name The New Frontiers -1. The New Frontiers is still considered one of the best Kingston Trio cover bands in Japan, and most likely the entire world in all honesty. They're that good. They're honestly probably more popular than East ever was, but only in incredibly obscure folk circles on the internet, and while the 1950s style of folk music The New Frontiers caters to, unfortunately just really isn't that popular anymore. They're sort of constricted to that realm, which is very unfortunate because everyone who plays with them and the original group is very talented. Want to actually hear the New Frontiers perform then? Check out the album The New Frontiers Sing the Kingston Trio 2008. This is the most accessible album from them on the English internet. Actual physical copies of it, though, can cost up to hundreds of dollars. Once again, this is folk music, so it is folk music, not really the folk rock psychedelia of East. Check it out. There's of course the obligatory word-for-word cover of the Kingston Trio's hit version of Tom Dooley, but a real favorite from this album is their version of El Matador. The New Frontiers also has a lot of other varied recordings and videos available online, but little overall collected material on YouTube. This undated live recording, maybe from around 2014 or earlier or so, uploaded to YouTube as the Kingston Trio tribute band The New Frontiers, is also worth a listen. Despite using the same image from the earlier album cover, it is actually a totally separate live performance. It is the usual duo of Seto and Morita, alongside either Chue Yoshikawa or Tom Guard. If it is a more recent concert recording, it is more likely to be Tom Guard, which commenters seem to think it is. Their versions of the folk classics Hangman and Greenback Dollar are some of the best ever put to posterity. They really earn their reputation. Posterity. Posterity then at last comes to Ruse Seto. Now, usually known as Aman, meaning peace in Sanskrit, Ruse Seto, after a spiritual experience while traveling. If there's anyone with a legacy from East to match Yoshikawa, it is Ruse Seto. It is very unfortunate he has been largely relegated to Japan since the 1980s. After East, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, he bounced between Japan and Seattle in the United States, usually with Gamorita, as a folk musician and later producer. He at one point even worked briefly with Yellow Magic Orchestra and some members from it. Seto's developing interest in electronic music would bear fruit in the 1980s though, partially inspired by YMO. Fortune favored him in 1979-1980, when he changed his musical focus more towards ambient psychedelia, a genre which would later be termed New Age, due to an interest in electric and computer production and mastering. This would result in a revised, extended version of Beautiful Morning, which would become a minor hit in Japan due to the radio show All Night Nippon. Ruse Seto has since been a somewhat regular guest on All Night Nippon and other radio shows in the Japanese music circuit. The Japanese radio and late-night industry is actually where most Japanese listeners know him from, surprisingly. Ruse Seto, post-East, has arguably been just as active and successful as Yoshikawa in the Japanese music business. Post-East saw 2 solo albums by him, Miroku, 1979, a Japanese pun on 567, which reflects the structure of several songs off the album, then Kegon Nemaki, 1984, meaning flower scroll, though inspired by the Kegon school of Japanese Buddhism. Both lovely menageries of Japanese traditional music, mainly flutes and biwa, and electronic ambience. Though Miroku has more of a storytelling element, which even veers into the psychedelic folk rock a la East. Miroku considered an obscure classic among fans of Japanese psychedelic music. Ruse Seto fully explores the border between Japanese traditional and electronic on it, alongside exploring his own interest in Buddhism, Indian and Japanese, as well as Japanese mythology. 2 recommendations off Miroku are the pseudo-lullaby Yumi no Shima, Land of Dreams, which is pop-like, then the lengthy and boisterous folk rock Susanoo, Ancient God Conquered the Dragon Song, which is based on the Japanese myth of Susanoo no Mikoto, which has Seto's vocals at his best, singing, chanting, and humming. Ruse Seto also released an English version of the album, if one cannot gel with the Japanese version for some reason, or if one simply wants to hear the direct version of Susanoo slaying the snake dragon tail in English. It's there. Kegon Nemaki is harder to describe because it is more Japanese psychedelic, with prog influences too. It is a musical reflection on a series of abstract and concrete images. Color, mystery, and mountain stream are a few examples. One should not let their minds be held down by the titles, though. Ruse Seto displays his masterful biwa playing on it. Biwa he studied for years under Kinshi Tsuruda, a classical master of the instrument. Harumi Hosono of YMO fame is also on this album, though, if anyone needs any more convincing to listen to it. While it has lyrics, Kegon Nemaki is much more relaxed, though not a lesser album, than Miroku. Both testaments to Ruse Seto's deep talents and interests. Both these albums are superb, but they are subjects to be fully explored another time. Today, Ruse Seto owns the Japanese music label Galaxy Music, which manages in air quotations, the new frontiers as far as just him and a few associated people and acts, alongside several other smaller related music ventures. His daughter, Hanayo, a stage name Luvian Hanayo Seto, is a singer as well and featured on Galaxy Music's website as a musician. The two, father and daughter, have performed together, such as with their rendition of the Hawaiian folk prayer Ho'oponopono song, which has, honestly, I'm not even sure, at least several dozen million views over several uploads on YouTube. Did anyone expect this video to include spiritual healing? The new age sound of Miroku and Kegon Nemaki is what East should have captured and combined with the mirthful energy heard in the New Frontiers, though East did have that to a limited extent. Unfortunately, Ruse Seto and East ended up being too late for the folk boom of the 1960s and too early for the New Age boom of the 1970s and 1980s in the United States. There's people who always get lucky at the wrong times. Honestly, listen to Miroku and Kegon Nemaki. These solo albums prove Ruse Seto is an underrated musician, even if people only remember him as that Ruse Seto. East is a case where the concept of the band, at least the concept as envisioned in America, suppressed and even crippled the abilities of the talent that composed it, rather than lifted up the collective whole. This was not even due to disagreements within the band. It is highly likely East simply felt the need to be something they were not. An exotic rock band from Japan come to the United States to enlighten the people into the mysteries of the, well, East. After the disbandment of East, the solo careers of each member shown they were much more than just East. Each had a wonderful menagerie of musical ideas and talents. Morita's love for English-language folk music, Seto's fascination with depicting Japanese culture through odd ambient and psychedelic tracks, Yoshikawa's bossa nova-influenced talent with the guitar, Asahi's interest in classical rock and roll, and even Adachi's drumming, which had such little time to shine. East, 1972, is an obscure footnote in American music, a forgotten footnote in Japanese music, and an often skipped-over footnote in several successful music careers. So back to that bootleg from Thailand. In mainland Asia, East was simply shuffled into the churn of Japanese and American culture that turned up on the shores throughout the 1970s. So Jar ended up placed at the tail end of Eric Clapton and Blue Oyster Cult on this top teen talent. Jar, if one has to guess, appealed to the taste for psychedelic rock and folk rock that was developing on mainland Southeast Asia at that point in time. It might be reaffirming to know East did have an audience. In the East, that is. Or actually west of Japan. So west of the East. East to west, back to east, then west again. Night falls in the east, and there's a song in the distance. The song of a hard-traveling man. I would like to give an Eastern origato to my supporter, Violanon.